What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Wednesday, September 1st.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, we have a 10-game slate here tonight. And hey, we got back on track with our bats last night, so that's great news. Let's see if we can keep the momentum going here tonight. So let's take a look at the pitcher position. I like Garrett Cole with a 12% pitching advantage over a low salary batting team, the Los Angeles Angels. Garrett Cole, he pitches 12% better versus righty batters, only giving up a .556 OPS versus righties, and he's facing 6 righties here tonight. On top of that, the Angels have only hit 16 of his last 84 pitches. That's a 190 batting average and a pretty big sample size. So Garrett Cole is $11,200 FanDuel salary. He's $1,300 less on DraftKings, projected at 38.2 fantasy points here tonight. He's averaging 44 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's been on fire, scoring 55, 46, and 47 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He has an ERA of 2.8. His record is 13-6 on the season, pitching an average of 99 pitches per game. So I like Garrett Cole here versus the Los Angeles Angels. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. I like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. with a 17% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Matt Harvey. Vladimir Guerrero Jr., he bats 5% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .899 OPS versus righties. And Matt Harvey, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 12% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.072 OPS versus righties. Now, Vladimir Guerrero Jr. is 5 for 7, batting a .714 batting average and a 1.893 OPS versus Harvey. He's $4,400 FanDuel salary, $1,700 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.3 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 14 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 19, 44, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a high-scoring game. 10 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. here versus Matt Harvey. I also like Salvador Perez with a 48% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Logan Allen. Salvador Perez, he bats 9% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .982 OPS versus lefties. And Logan Allen, he pitches his worst ball by far to righty batters, 40% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.030 OPS versus righties. Now, Salvador Perez is 0 for 1 versus Allen, and he's $3,400 FanDuel salary and $2,800 more on DraftKings. So I love that FanDuel price. Projected at 11.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 25, and 25 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Salvador Perez here versus Logan Allen. Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. Here's a super value play for you. If you're going to fit in Garrett Cole, you're going to need a couple value plays in your lineup. So I like Tony Kemp with a 32% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Willie Peralta. Tony Kemp is batting 43% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .748 OPS versus righties, and Willie Peralta is giving up a .708 OPS versus lefties. Now there's no at-bats versus Peralta yet, but Tony Kemp is only $2,100 FanDuel salary, only $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 8 fantasy points here tonight. Now he's only averaging 6 fantasy points per game on the season, but he scored 25, 13, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Tony Kemp here versus Willie Peralta. Okay, another value play for you. I like Josh Harrison, batting against that same low-salary pitcher, Willie Peralta. Josh Harrison is batting a .747 OPS versus righties, and Willie Peralta, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 10% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .787 OPS versus righties. Now I like this pick because Josh Harrison is 5 for 12, batting a .417 batting average and a .962 OPS versus Peralta. He's $2,700 FanDuel salary, $1,200 more on DraftKings, projected at 8.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25, 6, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game, so I like Josh Harrison here versus Willie Peralta.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I like Rafael Devers with a 62% batting advantage over Drew Rasmussen. Rafael Devers is batting 24% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .927 OPS versus righties, and Drew Rasmussen, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 38% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .898 OPS versus lefties. Rafael Devers is 1 for 3 with a 1.167 OPS versus Rasmussen. He's $4,100 FanDuel salary, $1,900 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 7, 0, and 37 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Rafael Devers here versus Drew Rasmussen. Okay, I got another value play for you. I like Hinzer Alberto with a 59% batting advantage over the low-salary pitcher Logan Allen. Hinzer Alberto is batting 19% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .790 OPS versus lefties, and Logan Allen, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 40% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.030 OPS versus righties. Now, Hinzer Alberto is 3 for 5, batting .600 with a 1.4 OPS versus Allen. He's only $2,400 FanDuel salary, $100 more on DraftKings, so I like that price on both sites, and he's projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight. Now, he's only averaged 4 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's only scored 0, 3, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games, but the splits are fantastic, and his batter versus pitcher matchup is very good, and his salary is super low, so I think he's in a good spot as a value play. So I like Hinzer Alberto here versus Logan Allen. Okay, who do we have at the shortstop position? I like Brandon Crawford, batting against Brett Anderson. Brandon Crawford is batting a .713 OPS versus lefties, and Brett Anderson is giving up a .762 OPS versus lefties. But the reason I like this pick is because Brandon Crawford is 7 for 18, batting a .389 batting average and a .920 OPS versus Anderson. He's $3,300 FanDuel salary, $1,300 more on DraftKings, projected at 9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 7, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Brandon Crawford here versus Brett Anderson. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. I like Kyle Schwarber with a 60% batting advantage over Drew Rasmussen. Kyle Schwarber is batting 22% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .882 OPS versus righties, and Drew Rasmussen, he pitches his worst ball versus lefty batters, 38% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .898 OPS versus lefties. Now, Kyle Schwarber is 0 for 1 versus Rasmussen, and he's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $1,900 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 31, 3, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Kyle Schwarber here versus Drew Rasmussen. I also like Brian Reynolds with a 40% batting advantage over Carlos Rodon. Brian Reynolds is batting a .783 OPS versus lefties, and Carlos Rodon, he pitches his worst ball by far to switch hitters, 36% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.073 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Rodon yet, and Brian Reynolds is $3,200 FanDuel salary, only $700 more on DraftKings, so I like that price on both sites, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 12, and 6 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Brian Reynolds here versus Carlos Rodon. Now I also like Lourdes Gurriel Jr. with a 22% batting advantage over that low salary pitcher, Matt Harvey. Lourdes Gurriel Jr. is batting 9% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .833 OPS versus righties, and Matt Harvey, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, giving up a 1.072 OPS versus righties. Lourdes Gurriel Jr. is 4 for 6, batting a .667 batting average and a 1.5 OPS versus Harvey. He's $3,100 FanDuel salary, $900 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.7 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 3, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 10 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Lourdes Gurriel Jr. here versus Matt Harvey. I also like Akil Baddoo with a 100% batting advantage over James Caprillion. Akil Baddoo is batting 40% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .848 OPS versus righties. And James Caprillion, he pitches his worst ball by far to lefty batters. Super far. 60% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.301 OPS versus lefties. There's no at-bats versus Caprillion yet, and Akil Baddoo is $3,000 FanDuel salary, only $300 more on DraftKings, so I like that price on both sites. He's projected at 10.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 6, 3, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Akil Baddoo here versus James Caprillion. And one more value play here. I like Austin Hayes with a 30% batting advantage over Steven Matz. Austin Hayes is batting 18% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .809 OPS versus lefties. And Steven Matz, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 12% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .938 OPS versus righties. Austin Hayes is 1 for 2 with a 1.5 OPS versus Matz. He's only $2,800 FanDuel salary and only $300 more on DraftKings. So I like that price on both sites. Projected at 10 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 10, 3, and 16 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 10 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Austin Hayes here versus Steven Matz.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.